Israel launches a surprise, debilitating attack on Iran and its nuclear facilities. But what Iran did next flipped the script, a fierce retaliation. We enter days of volatility and instability in the Middle East. What does it all mean? Let's find out. Spread the fire. Welcome back to SMWX. If you're new around here, my name is Sizwe Mpofu-Walsh, and on this channel, we explore South African and global politics through interviews and analysis. Now, I can only look at one thing that is happening in the world right now, this unfolding conflict between Iran and Israel that is threatening to engulf the region and maybe even the world. So in today's episode, I want to give you a sense of what has been happening, what is happening right now, and then take a step back and look at what the implications of all of this are, especially from the perspective of global politics. We've got a BRICS angle to this, we've got a US angle to this, we've got a nuclear weapons angle to this, and there's a South African angle to this as well. So let's kick off with what we've seen over the last 3 or 4 days. The so-called Operation Rising Lion from Israel caught Iran off guard, delivered a debilitating attack, particularly in its first day, and decapitated a series of senior Iranian military leaders. It also approached, and we'll get into this in more detail, the Iranian nuclear program. However, that program is very sophisticated and remains largely unscathed as far as I understand it in terms of its actual key underground facilities. But a lot of the support facilities around and the surface facilities were damaged. And then you've got nuclear scientists who've also been killed, a number of innocent civilians along with them, with entire apartment blocks hit. So that was the first strike, and it really was quite a shock, because at the moment that the strike came, Iran was on the brink of a 6th round of talks with the US, where it was going to be discussing its nuclear program. As you may have known, in the Obama administration, Iran and the US came to a nuclear agreement around Iran's nuclear program. Iran would be allowed to do certain things, and various very stringent verification methods would be given back in return. Trump's first term, he comes in, rips up that deal, and ever since then there's been some doubt as to Iran's nuclear program, although it needs to be said that Iran is a member of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. They're under an IAEA, International Atomic Energy Agency, safeguards agreement. Now, the IAEA in the build-up says that for the first time in a long time, Iran has fallen foul of its IAEA safeguards agreement. There is uranium that has been enriched up to the 60% level. 90% is where you get to nuclear bomb territory. Most states don't need that much enriched uranium, even for the kind of things you would use uranium for other purposes, civilian, medical, etc. But at the same time, there are these negotiations ongoing. Anyway, amidst all of this, Israel, which has long harbored the desire to strike Iran's nuclear program, finally strikes. And this strike was much more wide-ranging than many people expected it to be. I actually did a video in October last year when the two sides had exchanged fire, but these were largely symbolic attacks, and I said what could happen going forward from there, and one of the options was that Israel could strike Iran's nuclear facilities, or it could have struck key energy infrastructure, or it could have done a kind of decapitation attack. It turns out that they've actually tried to do everything. So this is throwing it all at Iran and hoping that the regime and the state itself actually capitulates. So in the midst of this, because Iran is also a sophisticated military power, some people were quite surprised by air defenses lacking at the time and the extent to which these senior military commanders allowed themselves to be vulnerable. And Iran, in the first opening hours or so, was kind of on its heels. And Israel, without doubt, struck a significant blow against Iran and its military command. But following that, we have seen quite a fierce response from Iran. In the first night, there were a few ballistic missiles that made their way over. Some of them penetrated Israel's air defenses. But in the subsequent nights, we've seen increasing, escalating attacks from Iran, some of its hypersonic missiles making it through and causing carnage in Tel Aviv, in Haifa. And so Iran is also not here to play and is inflicting serious damage. Now, the levels of casualties are not as high on the Israeli side. This is also largely due to the fact that Israel has created these underground shelters where people are able to go, and the Israeli Defense Force issues these warnings where people are able to leave above ground and go to these shelters. But the damage to infrastructure has been significant in Israel as well. So I want you to take a look at some of the images that we've seen in Iran's retaliatory response to Israel so that you can get a sense of the scale. Have a look at some of these attacks.
Okay, this is some short-range systems. Stay here, Yaniv. Pull out a little bit. Okay, there's just a massive amount of fire coming to Tel Aviv right now. Yaniv, get ready to pull it off the stick. Get off the sticks. All right, let's go. Time to go.
So that's effectively what has been happening. Let's come on to what's happening right now. I shoot this as day 3 turns into day 4. And Israel is continuing with the pace of its own attacks. In particular, we saw Iranian state TV targeted, this Iranian state channel, which is called IRIB, was actually singled out for an airstrike while the cameras were rolling. One of the most shocking moments of this whole debacle. Have a look at this.
Back to this breaking news now, where Iranian media is saying that Iranian state radio and television building has been targeted. This is the moment. Just take a watch and a listen. This is the moment that Israeli airstrikes hit the Iranian state radio and television building.
So, I mean, that's also designed not only to send a message to the Iranian people, but with a wider symbolic import, because you know how viral a clip like that is going to go. At the same time, Iran has also not let up. And they have announced, as I shoot this, that it'll be another long night of missile bombardment for Israel. And you've seen the scale of the scenes there. So right now, what we have is an interesting situation and an unprecedented one for a number of reasons. The first is that there's no doubt that Israel, in particular, often backed by the US and many European allies, is a firm and a strong military power. But up until this point, in terms of the Middle East, we've often seen, like in Afghanistan or in Iraq or in Libya, that when a country is bombed, well, that's it. But for the first time, you could maybe talk about the Iran-Iraq war in the 80s, but, you know, in my living memory, we have a situation where a Middle Eastern nation, Israel, has bombed another Middle Eastern nation, an ally of the US. And in response, that nation hasn't completely capitulated, but has retaliated with quite a lot of military might itself. And Iran has shown that its missile program, which is really the linchpin of its defense strategy, is not something to be trifled with either. So these Iranian attacks, I think, must be taken seriously. and they're inflicting serious damage. And now the question becomes, in this conflict, who has the stamina? Because Israel will have the benefit of its air force and will have a strategy of using aerial bombardment. Iran's aerial defenses have improved since that first day, but clearly Israel is still getting through a lot of them. But Iran has the superior ballistic missile program, hypersonic missile program. And some Iranian observers, such as Professor Mohammad Marandi, have suggested that Iran has thousands of these missiles underground. And so it is ready for a long war. So the question is, will Israel's aerial bombardment strategy be sustainable over the long term? Costly. Iran is a very big country. It's got 90 million people. It is massive in size. Israel, of course, a much smaller country in size and in population. And so, but it has in some ways a resource advantage. It has more powerful backers, but more and backers that might be more inclined to engage in the conflict. But at the same time, Iran has Russia and China who have, if not issued direct support for the military interventions of Iran, have come out very strongly in suggesting that it has a right to defend itself, to quote that oft-used phrase in this Middle Eastern context. So it's not clear yet from this vantage point who's winning, but the idea that Israel may have had that it would be able to launch this massive strike, cause Iran to be so disconcerted and damaged that it wouldn't be able to respond, has been proven false. Iran has been able to respond. It's been able to respond quite stringently, and it's now inflicting serious damage on Israel too. And this is where we sit at the moment. So the question, I suppose, that arises from here is, what are some of the implications that go broader than the bilateral conflict between these two nations? And how can we understand this in a bit more depth? Perhaps the first is the question around Iran's nuclear program. Because the pretext of Israel's strike was that Iran was irreversibly close to obtaining a nuclear weapon. But the problem with this claim is that at least Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has been claiming that Iran is close to a nuclear weapon for something like 30 or 40 years. And there's actually a clip doing the rounds that I want to show you from a very long time ago where exactly the same or very similar accusations were made around Iran. So this claim that they are on the brink of a nuclear weapon has been there for a very long time. Have a look at this.
Stake is the future of the world, and nothing could imperil our common future more than the arming of Iran with nuclear weapons. In the case of Iran's nuclear plans to build a bomb, this bomb has to be filled with enough enriched uranium. And Iran has to go through 3 stages. The first stage, they have to enrich enough low-enriched uranium. The second stage, they have to enrich enough medium-enriched uranium. And the third stage and final stage, they have to enrich enough high-enriched uranium for the first bomb. Where's Iran? Iran's completed the first stage. Took them many years, but they completed it, and they're 70% of the way there. Now they're well into the second stage. And by next spring, at most, by next summer, at current enrichment rates, they will have finished the medium enrichment and move on to the final stage. From there, it's only a few months, possibly a few weeks, before they get enough enriched uranium for the first bomb. Ladies and gentlemen, what I've told you now is not based on secret information. It's not based on military intelligence. It's based on the public reports of the International Atomic Energy Agency. Anybody could read them. They're online. So if these are the facts, and they are, where should a red line be drawn? A red line should be drawn right here. Before Iran completes the second stage of nuclear enrichment necessary to make a bomb, before Iran gets to a point where it's a few months away or a few weeks away from amassing enough enriched uranium to make a nuclear weapon. And I believe that faced with a clear red line, Iran will back down. And this will give more time for sanctions and diplomacy to convince Iran to dismantle its nuclear weapons program altogether.
Now, it is true that the IAEA Board of Governors came out and said that Iran was recently in contravention of this nuclear verification and safeguards agreement that it has with the IAEA. This is the first time in a very long time, but it is also true that the IAEA, yes, it is a global institution, but it's a global institution with certain power dynamics. Like many other institutions like the World Bank, the IMF, the IAEA is largely Western dominated. And if you look at the inequality of nuclear weapons and who has them and who doesn't, the West largely, which tends to support Israel, has the disproportionate say in these institutions. So if you look at the nuclear weapon states, who has nuclear weapons? It's the United States, France, Russia, the United Kingdom, and China. And then there are 4 other states who have nuclear weapons, but they aren't part of the broad global agreement around nuclear weapons, which is the Non-Proliferation Treaty. That's India, Pakistan, North Korea, and guess who? Israel. Yes, Israel has nuclear weapons in the first place, which is a huge violation of the Non-Proliferation Treaty to which they're not even part. So there's a certain amount of hypocrisy with one state saying, we're going to bomb you before you get nuclear weapons because you're not allowed to have them, when in actual fact, we already have them. And so many observers have said that, sure, it would be great if Iran doesn't get a nuclear weapon. Virtually no one in the world really wants to have Iran to have a nuclear weapon. But what should really happen is that the Middle East should become a nuclear weapon-free zone, in the same way that Africa is a nuclear weapon-free zone, or Latin America, for example. But the problem you have in the Middle East is that one state has nuclear weapons and all the rest don't. And of course, the presence of those nuclear weapons in itself inclines other states towards proliferation, because they don't want to be on the receiving end of a serious nuclear attack. And we've seen that Israel is certainly not shy of attacking any of its neighbors. So there is a certain degree, in my view, of hypocrisy around the idea that Israel would launch a preemptive strike on Iran over nuclear weapons when it itself has nuclear weapons. And at the same time, a nuclear weapons program is really built on a number of different things. So to prove that someone or a state wants to pursue nuclear weapons, sure, you've got to have the technology. But in actual fact, the technology has been around for a very long time. Nuclear weapons are actually quite an old technology. That's why they were used in 1945. So we've known how to build nuclear weapons for a long time. It's actually not impossible to get hold of that technology, especially the technology to enrich uranium, which is what you need to do for a nuclear weapon. In addition to that, you then have to have quite a sophisticated missile program, which clearly Iran has. But then you've got to have the political will to pursue nuclear weapons and have a nuclear program. And although Iran has the technical capability, it has the nuclear enrichment facilities, and it has the kind of military capability that would allow it to take this highly enriched uranium and make it into an actual bomb that could be delivered, there has not been any clear evidence that, politically speaking, the Islamic Republic of Iran has decided to get a nuclear weapon. And in fact, just recently, the US's head of intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, said as much before a hearing. I think it was a congressional or a Senate hearing. She said that the US intelligence estimates do not suggest that Iran is intent on developing a nuclear weapon. And senior Iranian leaders for a long time have said this. There's been a religious decree against it from the supreme leader of Iran, etc. So on the question of whether Iran really was intent on pursuing a nuclear weapon, it seems a little implausible to the extent that they were about to go for a sixth round of negotiations with the US, that the US itself did not imagine that Iran had taken the political decision to pursue this program, and also that we hadn't had any public statements coming out of Iran that their own position had changed. But what it is probably true to say is that Iran is happy to be on the brink of nuclear weapons. And it's maybe happy to move a little closer to that brink in order to signal to Israel and to some of its other adversaries in the world that if push comes to shove, if it is attacked in an unprovoked way, it can move towards those nuclear weapons. But the danger for me, as we look at questions of nuclear non-proliferation more generally now, is that, if anything, it's quite possible that this Israeli strike may have moved Iran closer, not further, towards a nuclear weapon, because there will be those within the higher reaches of Islamic government, Islamic Republic government, saying, well, this is exactly why we need a nuclear weapon, so that we can defend ourselves against these kind of attacks. So that's a little bit on the nuclear non-proliferation side of things. Let's come on to the great power equation, because some of the observers have suggested that Israel's strategy here is to drag the US into this conflict. It may not be able to sustain this level of strikes throughout. It may not be able to sustain the level of damage that's coming from Iran over a very long time. But what it can do is it can bring in America, and then the calculus and the equation changes. So we have some very interesting things coming out of America, because Trump, and you need to watch this clip, campaigned on ending wars, not starting them. And so there's a huge debate going on within MAGA world right now, with Tucker Carlson, people like Tucker Carlson, the former Fox News host on the one hand, versus some more hawkish people within the Republican Party on the other hand, who are arguing about whether they should defend their arch ally Israel and get militarily involved. But they have sent this message that MAGA is actually about creating peace and not war. So check out how Trump campaigned in the election itself.
I will end the war in Ukraine. I will stop the chaos in the Middle East, and I will prevent World War III from happening. And you have no idea how close we are.
Trump has basically, early on in this, the US kind of distanced itself from the attack, saying we had nothing to do with it, but if Iran hits US assets in the Middle East, then we will respond and retaliate. But as it appeared that Israel's strike was a success in the early opening hours, then Trump appeared to move to take credit for it and said, well, I gave Iran 60 days and it's day 61. We knew all about these attacks, etc. But again, now, as things have become more complicated and as it's turned into more of a tug of war, with blows being landed on either side, the US has been notably silent, and there's clearly a massive debate going on within the US as to whether they intervene, because Israel does need the help. But if they do intervene, then they could get locked in another forever war. And we know how those ended. And remember that Iran is not Iraq under Saddam Hussein. It's not Libya under Gaddafi. Iran has the capacity to fight back. It's a massive country. You can't, like, invading Iran is just like, you would need a lot of troops to invade Iran, hundreds of thousands maybe, if you were being serious about it. So Iran is a different kind of adversary, and it could really exact a serious toll, even if it lost in the end. The question would be, would that be a price worth paying for both Israel and the US, given that the misadventures in the Middle East up to this point are part of the reason why Trump himself got elected in the first place. So there is that question, but unfortunately, it's not that simple, because we have a question of, if Iran is able to inflict inappropriate damage in the eyes of Israel. Remember, Israel always has the nuclear option available to it. Now, I can't even believe I'm saying that, but things are moving so fast in global politics. You know, the use of nuclear weapons is something that hasn't happened since 1945, and it's largely viewed as one of the most terrible and evil things that can be done. But when a nation faces an existential threat as well, when a nation like Israel that has proven itself willing and ready to inflict massive damage on civilian populations, if it feels as if its back is against the wall and the US is not intervening, it might even threaten to use nuclear weapons to bring the US in. There's this nuclear strategy known as catalytic deterrence. It's just a fancy way of saying you kind of threaten to use nuclear weapons against someone so that you bring a larger ally into the fight for you, or else you're going to use nuclear weapons. So Israel could say to the US, hey, this is not going well for us. We need to deliver a decisive blow. We're going to go nuclear, or you come and help us. And that will be a very difficult conversation. On the other hand, the US should be able to say to Israel, no, don't do that. But we've seen that the US is prepared to give Israel a very long leash in places like Gaza, where pretty much the entire world has come out in condemnation of Israel's actions there. But because the US and Israel have stood relatively firmly together, Israel has been able to continue to perpetuate the humanitarian catastrophe that is unfolding in Gaza through Israeli aggression there. Now, as I say, if you want more backstory to all of this, you can check out some of my former videos. But so that's the US side of the equation. Then there's a Russia-China side of the equation. Iran is key to China in terms of its energy demand. It's key to Russia in terms of some of Russia's broader geopolitical plans, especially in Eurasia, where Russia is really trying to link up a lot of Central Asian powers to some Middle Eastern powers all the way in a corridor through to Russia, and Iran is key to that plan. And so they recently struck a very important agreement together. They cooperate militarily, and often in the Middle East, they've been on the same side of issues. Now, as you know, Russia is also one of the world's preeminent military powers. So if Russia sees that Iran could have its back against the wall, then the question is, how far would Russia be able to assist? And in any nuclear situation, Russia would probably also have something to say about that. And then you've got China as well. So let's take a look at some of the things that Russia and China have been saying. In an earlier statement today, Russia's Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov said he believes Iran is exercising its right to defend itself in an attack in the attacks against Israel. And China, who is usually quite measured in its rhetoric, has really come out condemning Israel's attack on Iran. I want you to take a look at what UN Chinese ambassador to the UN Fu Kong said about the attack. Have a look at this clip.
Ambassador, what do you think of the current situation concerning Israel and Iran?
We strongly condemn the Israelis' attack on Iran. This is a violation of the Iran's sovereignty and territorial integrity. And we are particularly concerned that they are attacking nuclear facilities, which is another red line that Israel has crossed.
So as you can see, Russia and China, even though they might not intervene as decisively as the US, do have an interest in this conflict and do have an interest in protecting the Islamic Republic of Iran. And so one of the dangers, and we shouldn't catastrophize too much, but one of the dangers or one of the scenarios is that this war really spirals out of control, and Iran and the Western powers which back Israel and the Western powers which back Israel, and Iran and some of the BRICS powers which back Iran find themselves entangled in a conflict. And that is a very dangerous and scary scenario that I hope we're able to avoid. But these are the stakes. These are the stakes. Meanwhile, there is talk of a potential ceasefire. But what would need to happen for such a thing is probably for all of these powers to get around a table, for the US, Russia, and China, and then Israel and Iran, maybe some European powers, to come together and say, listen here, this is getting out of hand. How do we come together to cut a compromise that averts this descending into major prolonged regional war or the worst case scenario of world war? Now, the thing is, you never want to predict world war, and world war is always predicted. Every year and every month there's World War III, and it never materializes. But the world is a more dangerous place today than it was 5 years ago, that's for sure. I haven't even spoken about the unfolding Russia-Ukraine conflict, which in some ways is threatening to merge with this Iran-Israel conflict. And remember, the two aren't really that far away. We think of them as different theaters, but the Middle East and Eastern Europe aren't that far away. And so major powers are interested in this conflict, and they fall on different sides of it. Now, as for South Africa, our foreign policy has been one of strategic non-alignment, and we take a lot of flack for that, but I actually think that our foreign policy has been one of the better things of the Cyril Ramaphosa administration. Domestic agenda is terrible. There's a new national dialogue now, and cities are falling apart. And so domestically, I think Ramaphosa hasn't done much. But internationally, this is part of the reason, people were saying the ANC and South Africa must cut ties fully with Iran and BRICS. You can't be living in this world and not see the importance of Russia, China, even places like Iran. That doesn't mean you must now not become friends with the US and Europe and have, ties across that side of the aisle too. But the point is that similar to India, similar to Brazil, South Africa cannot ignore all of these different powers, and we have to try to maintain relationships with as wide a spectrum of partners as we can. And so this idea that South Africa would cut ties with Iran, well, now you see why that's not such an easy equation. Maybe on day one of this conflict, people were saying, well, look, Iran is just a weak country. It's not. It's a serious military power. So is Israel. But South Africa, unfortunately, can't afford to just ignore the BRICS side of the global political equation. And we have to continue to play a strategic game of maintaining alliances basically across the board right now. So that's some analysis on what we've seen with the Israel-Iran conflict. We're increasingly going to be looking at global issues on this channel. Let me know in the comments down below if you enjoy these global analyses, if you'd like me to keep focusing on the Israel-Iran conflict. Comment down below. This is a space for discourse and dialogue. If you disagree, that's fine. We always invite guests from a wide range of perspectives. So let me know what you think in the comments down below. And tell me as well which way you think this is going to go. Do you think this is going to end in a ceasefire soon? Do you think we're going to see more of the same? Do you think we're going to see Israel prevailing? Do you think we're going to see Iran prevailing? What's your view of where this is going? Let me know down in the comments below. Like, share, subscribe. Help us get to 250,000 subscribers and keep it locked. on SMWX. IAEA.
Na, 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 na.